Okay, so now we're going to look at creating a very simple three-bone chain and animating it. And so before we actually start animating, there's a few other things we're going to look at with regards to bones and identifying bones. And so if I tab into edit mode, I always make the same mistake there, tab into edit mode, and I'm just going to extrude Z and extrude Z. And so what we have is a very simple three-bone armature. And before we go any further with animating, we had a look in the last video just very simply creating complex bones. And as I'm sure you can appreciate, a bone structure is going to become very, very complicated very quickly, particularly if we're dealing with a humanoid form. We have multiple bones in the back, we have a neck, we have a head, we have shoulders, arms, hands. And if we get very detailed, we have fingers and thumbs, feet, IK constraints, the whole lot that, obviously things that we're not familiar with just yet. And much like when we're working in other aspects creatively, we want to identify things. If we're working with layers in something like GIMP, we want to identify the layers so that we know what each layer contains. And the same can be said when we're working with an armature. We would like to be able to identify what the armature is called. So first of all, if we have a look in the outliner in the top right up here, we have our armature, okay, and we can see that if we click and open armature up, we have the armature, then we have bone 001 and bone 002. So first of all, if I just right click and rename this, let's call this test underscore skeleton, okay, for the sake of this particular demonstration. And we've got bone 001 and bone 002. Now, I know that the very first bone we have in here is called bone, and Blender names it 001 and then 002, so that's all well and good, but what we need to do is we need to understand exactly how we can identify the names of these bones ourselves so that we can work in an organized fashion. And if we look at our properties along here, we have object data, and this is data that pertains to the overall armature, the overall skeleton, and right next to it we have this little bone icon, and this is where we can identify information for specific bones based on what we've selected. And so let's first of all have a look at bones. And now we can see that we've got, based on the information, if I select a bone, we have a bone name in here. It's quite straightforward, it's quite simple. Select the middle one, bone 001, and select the third one, and it's called bone 002. So this is going to be a bit goofy, but let's call this one Tom, Dick, and Harry. Okay, and so now if we look, and I've hit enter, and so now if we look in our test skeleton under armature, we have Tom, we have Dick, and we have Harry. Now this is an innocuous little skeleton we've made, but under normal circumstances that might be thigh, that might be backbone, it might be skull, it might be neck. So that's very easy for us to be able to organize the naming of our bones in this particular way of working. That's all we need to look at with regards to the actual naming of the bones. Now if we have a look at our armature properties or object properties, so if we select that, we have a lot more information that we can work with here. And as I tend to like to do, we can close all of these off and makes it a lot easier for us to look at. But if we look at, we're not worried about skeleton, let's have a look at display. And in display, we can actually change the way the bones look. So we have octahedral, we can change them to stick, we can change them to B-bones, we can change them to envelopes, and we can change them to wire. Now for the sake of this activity, we're going to work with octahedral. Okay. And one of the other things that we can do is we can select names. And so by selecting names, we can actually see the names of the bones: Harry, Dick, and Tom. And so we can actually see the names of our bones on screen next to the bones themselves. And so while we're still learning and we're still becoming familiar with this, that's a fantastic function that allows us to ensure that we know what we're working with. At this stage, that's all we're going to work with regards to setting up our skeleton. Now what we want to do is we want to animate our skeleton. And so I'm just going to close the tools on the left-hand side here, duplicate a window, and I'm going to bring up what's called a dope sheet. And we haven't used the dope sheet yet. I'm going to make my animation 50 frames long, keep it small, because this is just to play around with and get a feel for how animation works. Okay, so you can see that if we just hold the, just scale that out like so. So I'm holding the control and middle mouse button on an Apple here. I think it's very similar on Windows machines. And I'm just going to do the same over here so that what I'm seeing in my viewport is all that needs to be animated. Okay. Now when we're animating a rig, we need to be in what's called pose mode. And up until now, we've worked with edit mode, and we've worked with object mode, and we have this new mode that's open to us when working with skeletons called pose mode. And we can either move to it via this little menu at the bottom of the Blender window, but I prefer shortcuts, and Control Tab will take us into pose mode. And the most noticeable thing when we're in pose mode is that when I select a bone, it's highlighted blue. So this is important for us to be able to at least visually recognize the mode that we're in. If we're editing objects or we're in object mode, the highlight is orange. Okay, and so what I can do now is, first of all, I'm going to select all of my bones and I'm going to insert a locate scale key. And what's happened in my dope sheet is it's provided test skeletons the identification of the armature. We have Tom, Dick and Harry, and each of these has information based on scale, rotation and location. Okay, and we can see that that's represented here via these orange keyframes. Let's just say I want my animation to loop, so I'll go to frame 50 and I'll go insert locate scale, and now we can see that we've got this orange line joining between the first and last keyframe. So that means that regardless of what I do in between, this animation will loop. And now if I go to frame 10, so I'll go to frame 10 and I'm going to rotate, rotate and rotate. And if I go insert locate scale, insert locate scale, there we go. And so now we get this animation happening like this. Now, having to insert locate scale every time is a bit of a nuisance. Okay, so I'm going to undo those keyframes. Okay, and I'm going to undo all that movement. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this feature that's down the bottom here, that's called auto keyframe. So if I hit this little record button, what that does is every time I move a bone, it will automatically place a keyframe. So, and if we look at what's happening up here in the dope sheet, every time I move a bone, it's placing keyframes in. And what that means is I can now work very quickly through my animation. And this animation is not going to be very good, but at least it gives you the idea of what's happening. Okay, and so now if I hit the play key, or Alt A, we get this very basic animation of our skeleton. So it's quite straightforward, it's quite easy to get things to move, and when we start using automatic keyframes, we can move very quickly when it comes to posing our skeletons and creating animations. Okay, so have a play with that, get familiar with using those tools. Very important that we learn how to name our armatures, how to name our bones, so that we can maintain organized files. And then it's also important that we get familiar with how to insert those keyframes in the dope sheet. Okay, so in a moment, once you've had a play with that, we can have a look at the next video. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at taking that basic skeleton there and binding it to a mesh, so that what we're doing is actually animating a mesh object.